Well, look here.
Good morning, sir. My pleasure. Nice to see you here this morning.
Looky here.
How are you?
Look at
My
this.
pleasure. Man,
Look at this.
how are you, sir? My pleasure. Indeed, nice to see you.
Looky here.
Adam.
Mr. Jefferson.
Sir. My pleasure. How are you, sir? My pleasure. I thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Indeed, the esteemed trumpeter. What a pleasure, sir, to play our national anthem as I have known it.
Mr. President, it's an honor.
Indeed, my honor. Well, I cannot help but feel somewhat of great esteem to hear that melody from such a distance, to be able to make my way here to this land. To be able to go west, if you will, of the dividing line of our Louisiana territory. To be able to come here to your settlement named for a Virginian. General Houston. Sam Houston, whose father owned an extensive plantation near my holdings of the Natural Bridge in Rockbridge County. To think that as I arrive here and have entered before you, what a profound thought that the President of the United States has entered amongst you, and you all remain seated. Well, citizens, in my opinion, that is exactly as it ought to be, for lest we forget, who holds the reins of our government? Well, do not all answer at once. Who holds the reins of our government? You do. The people do. The citizens. And so therefore, in my opinion, yes, you ought to remain seated to your pleasure, your comfort. While as your public servant, it is not only an obligation, but it is my honorarium to remain standing in your presence. To be able to have the opportunity to reflect together upon our remarkable history. To think indeed that when I was the age of many of those so privileged to pursue an education, we were not yet this remarkable nation. We were still governed by a monarchy 3,000 miles removed. And though I was born and brought up in the frontier, the wilderness of Virginia, in fact, I still refer to myself as a savage of the wilderness. We were all brought up as Englishmen, taught British manners, British habits, British customs. I was born and brought up amongst the Aborigines, from the Latin word ab, before the original people, before any others. They had their own different manners, habits, and customs. But one thing is certain, that we knew that a change was occurring here in the former colonies of Great Britain. We knew from one generation after the next we were becoming the less and less British and the more and more American, self-evident. A new people, the likes of which the world has never seen before, and yet a people coming into their own with what had been known from one generation after the next, from time immemorial, to know that before the word was even conjured up, the name even applied, there was still the idea of America. I heard Mr. Whitney refer to our remarkable acquisition of New Orleans and Louisiana. Yes. Now part of that idea of America. Previously owned, as you know, by the Spaniards, but before them by the French. To know that they were here long before the British ever arrived, and yet collectively now, with that acquisition, all together known as Americans. I will tell you that we thought we could continue with the free trade along the Mississippi River that had been granted us by the Spaniards once that land had been ceded to them as a result of the French and Indian War. But no, at the time of our presidential election of 1800, we learned of a secret treaty being contracted between Spain and France, denying us thereby, our nation, the right of deposit on the island of New Orleans, meaning a cessation of the free trade. We could no longer place our produce in warehouses on the island of New Orleans. We have been able freely to do so without paying any duties. If we wished to pick up any of the produce to trade with the rest of the world, we were welcome to do so. That ended. The beacon light that had drawn our migration westward across this continent was at a standstill. How should we continue that further settlement? How should we continue our commerce? It was then that I came up with the idea that we might be able simply to conquer New Orleans, take it over. It was too vital to our protection, safety, and defense, and to our free enterprise. I was dissuaded in that, perhaps many of you know, by a friend of mine. I was introduced to him in Paris by Dr. Benjamin Franklin. He was a Frenchman who made his way to our nation with his two sons, stepped foot on American soil in Newport, Rhode Island, the first day of January, 1800. He was the one who said to me, "Monsieur President, you will flatter the French far more by offering to purchase." So it was that I then thought this would be the more civil action. I therefore appointed my good friend, my fellow collaborator on our Declaration of American Independence, Robert R. Livingston, to be Minister Plenipotentiary. The very same post I held, plenty meaning all, potentiary meaning powers. That individual to hold all of the powers of our government, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. And I wrote him a letter that I wished him to hand to General Bonaparte in representing us in the negotiations for simply the acquisition of New Orleans itself. I advised him, as I wrote in the letter, please assure Bonaparte that if the French occupy New Orleans, they will be the natural enemy of our nation, and we may have to marry ourselves with the British. And then I advised Livingston not to offer any more than $7 million for the purchase of New Orleans. We only had $17 million in our treasury at that time. In fact, we still do we not? About $17 million. On what I've been told. Well, citizens, I was not there. Livingston was Minister Plenipotentiary. He sailed to France, and he was introduced to General Bonaparte by my friend from France, my friend who had sailed back to his homeland to be there during that negotiation. And rather than Livingston, it was this gentleman who handed that letter to General Bonaparte. They were friends at the time. I've always believed the success of any negotiation is found within the intimacy of the parties involved. Well, at first, Napoleon, somewhat taken aback, thinking $7 million for the control of one of the mightiest arteries of commerce upon the globe is a bit much. But I can add to that. I can add to it over 830,000 square miles west of the Mississippi River, and I will place the price tag upon it at $22 million. Well, Livingston was taken aback. He thought, what could he do then? And so he pursued freely the offer of $12 million, well beyond the price I admonished him to hold strongly to. Bonaparte came back, counted at $15 million. Livingston struck while the iron was hot. We could ill afford it. Two treaties were drawn up then concurrently. One in French, signed on the 30th day of April, 1803. The other in English, signed 3 days later. And Livingston informed me in a letter that he then wrote of these successful negotiations that when Bonaparte signed the treaty in French, he remarked in English, "I now create the United States of America a future world power." Remarkable his foresight. Remarkable that we went well beyond my admonishment, my suggested price, that we relied on one individual as Minister Plenipotentiary to negotiate this deal. And would anyone know the name of the Frenchman who was involved in these secret negotiations, whom more than any other I relied upon at the moment to follow his instructions, not to conquer New Orleans, but to suggest purchasing New Orleans, and then to see the great benefit of over 830,000 square miles to be included? Anyone know the name of the individual to whom I'm referring? No? He was a good friend of Lafayette's. Gentlemen and ladies, let us never forget Monsieur Pierre Samuel Dupont. Monsieur Dupont, what greater evidence of the success of free enterprise in our nation for so many who have sought these shores from across the globe to pursue that innate liberty of making for a better world, a better future for themselves, their children, and the future. No, citizens, I cannot help but think that as I come here, as I heard Mr. Whitney refer to our remarkable achievement of the purchase of New Orleans and Louisiana, to think that as I come here, you all are seated and is equally astounding an example of free enterprise. For I am told that about 6,600 acres here, upon which your settlement has been founded, was purchased by two brothers from the port of New York City for the purchase price of $5,000. Now tally that up. $5,000 for 6,600 acres. Is that not a much better deal than we struck with France? So you see, citizens, we are a remarkable people from the beginning of a remarkable enterprise. To realize that free enterprise was the founding principle of the settlement here in North America, whether it was for the French, for the Spaniards, and particularly the Englishmen. In fact, my progenitor, my great-great-great-grandfather, John Jefferson, sailed from London and stepped foot on Jamestown Island in 1612. He invested in one of the upriver plantations on the James River, Flower 200, and because of the success of his investment, he was invited, along with another investor in Flower 200, one Mr. Edmund Rossingham, the two of them, to sail down the James River once more to Jamestown Island, and there in August of 1619, to be seated in the very first English-speaking representative form of government in the New World, the Virginia House of Burgesses. They were invited to be seated there because they were the examples of the success of free enterprise. The settlement at Jamestown itself, the best example. And a few years later, of course, up in what became known as Massachusetts Bay, that further success of free enterprise, religious freedom and liberty, when those from England stepped foot on the shores of Plymouth and established their settlement. To realize that as a result of this, citizens, free enterprise founded the very first nation in the history of man upon principle, not upon royalty nor nobility. Principles that have been argued and debated from time immemorial with respect to the innate right of an individual to self-government. And I dare say, having had the opportunity of an education, though born in the wilderness, it was the provision in my father's estate. And when I say the provision in his estate, because, citizens, at the early age of 14 years, my father, who was only 49, passed away. I was the eldest son in a family of 10 children. Can you imagine the responsibility upon my shoulders there to be of what support and help I could be to my mother, left a widow, to preside over the rearing of 10 children? I've often written, at the age of 14, being thrown out into the world without a member of my family fit to guide me, it is a wonder that I did not fall off into bad company. But my father held a reverence for education. He well understood through his family line here in this new world that freedom is not free. It requires an eternal vigilance, and that which will help us to hold more securely the reins of self-government is indeed education, citizens. Ignorance is not bliss. An educated citizen body, as I have written, will always be a safe and well-educated citizen body, a well-defended citizen body, that those men here, as for I only know the white male, the eldest in their family, to have that privilege if the family has the means. Gentlemen, how well we know education will always prove the true corrective for the abuses of any authoritative power. That was afforded me, and I took a great advantage of it. The influence of my teachers have followed me throughout my entire life, particularly Dr. William Small, who held the chair of mathematics and natural philosophy at the Old Royal College of William and Mary. Of him I have written many times. He had gentlemanly and correct manners, an enlarged mind, and a happy talent for communication, perhaps more than any other. He fixed my destinies. I was well prepared to read law with Mr. George Wythe in Williamsburg, and then to enter into public office at the age of 26 to be elected to the House of Burgesses. And as many of you know, but a few years later, in 1776 to be appointed a delegate to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, and furthermore to be invited to take up the pen and to draft our Declaration of American Independence. It is ours, and it has become the beacon light for the rest of the world to help mankind understand their inalienable rights given to them, not by any government, not by any ruler, given to them by nature and nature's God. I stand here before you, honored indeed to be the author, but I stand here before you to simply fess up. As I have written, there is not one new or original thought in our Declaration of American Independence. Not one. In fact, I have written, I've never come up with one new or original thought. I am no genius. Everything in our Declaration has already been written. It has already been argued. It has already been debated. You may find it in the elementary books of public right, the works of Aristotle, Cicero, Algernon Sidney, John Locke. Those authors, their works that each and every one of you have read and reread frequently, do you not? No, you do not. I know you do not. With the exception of Mrs. Elliot, over yonder, I know that she peruses them frequently, and gentlemen, what a mark of an enlightened lady, I'm delighted to say. But no, citizens, let us not forget, in 1776, many Americans could not even read. I was one of 5 men appointed by President John Hancock of the Continental Congress to a committee to draft our Declaration of American Independence. The others you may know, Dr. Franklin from Pennsylvania, John Adams from Massachusetts, Roger Sherman from Connecticut, and Robert R. Livingston from New York. I was the only one on the committee south of the line drawn by Messrs. Mason and Dixon. It was Dr. Franklin we looked to when we first met on the 11th of June in 76. Dr. Franklin, who ought to take up the pen, he was our mentor, our elder, one of the wealthiest men in our nation, self-made, former postmaster of the Crown, a successful printer. Franklin turned down the invitation. He said, "Gentlemen, I fear as I grow older, I do not care to have anything else I may write suffer the scrutiny of a committee." He looked at me at the same time Mr. Adams did. It was Adams, John Adams, who said, "Gentlemen, I believe Jefferson writes as well as anyone else, including me." He said, "But gentlemen, lest we forget, a Virginian ought to be at the head of this business," because it was the resolution of Virginia, penned in Williamsburg, the 15th day of May, 1776, pronouncing Virginia free and independent of Great Britain, and pronouncing the more so that these colonies are and are of right ought to be free and independent states. That resolution, which spurred the debate to place the vote for independence, and spurred President Hancock to create a committee to draft the reasons why, to pronounce it to the rest of the world. I took up the pen the next day, the 12th of June, and realized I must disseminate the wisdom passed down one generation to the next, the wisdom of liberty, the understanding of freedom. How do I do this? I need to draft something that must be publicly read, have a dramatic effect, that when read publicly will lift the human spirit to noble sentiments of what man can accomplish in collaboration with his fellow man for improving the condition of mankind. And so it was, I had to shed the lofty sophisms of these ancient authors, explain it in clear and simple terms, place before the world the common sense of the matter. That matter simply that our American Revolution was fought on behalf of the common man, to show the rest of the world that we had come to understand in the diversity of our population that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a few booted and spurred ready to ride them, but that man holds an inalienable right in nature to burst forth from the monkish chains of ignorance, to grasp the reins of self-government. In fact, I fess up the further to say the entire second paragraph out of our Declaration is nearly word for word John Locke. John Locke, I tried to adapt it the more so to be better understood, to be better comprehended by the common man. It was Locke, however, who wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created. We are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, amongst which are life, liberty, and..." No, that's what I wrote. No, if you will, that is my own, well, my own fulfillment of Locke's intent. Lest we forget, John Locke wrote, amongst our inalienable rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Now there you are, Miss Elliott. As Shakespeare would say, there's the rub. There's the rub. Yes, at your table, I heard it distinctly. Property. Now, gentlemen, how well we know in free enterprise that man has an inalienable right in the pursuit of property. But lest we forget, Mr. Locke's intention, my own, in order to elaborate them also in a simple phrase, the pursuit of happiness. Lest we forget, this element has been from time immemorial an inalienable right of every individual and a people. It comes from the ancient Greek word arete, A-R-E-T-E, the pursuit of excellence. And this is fulfilled, if you will, by the Justinian Code, that first civil body of law prescribed for the civilizing of man in the 6th century by the Roman Emperor Justinian I. The foundation of the Roman law, the Justinian Code, everyone is born free. Everyone comes into this world with a right to their own person and to move wherever they choose to improve their condition. Now, mind you, citizens, that was nearly forgotten through the ages of the darkest ignorance. Was it not for the many monks and scribes in their dark cells by the flicker of candlelight that were able to transcribe that wisdom of the ancient world? For rest you assured, the past was not less intelligent than we are. To be able to transcribe that wisdom so it would be available for that which I refer to as the most precious invention of the modern world. Do you know what I am referring to? The printing press. The printing press for the dissemination of information to the greatest extent, provoking people to want to read. And what happens when an individual begins to read for themselves? They begin to think for themselves. I've always said if people would simply think for themselves and speak what they think, they'd find they have more in common than they would otherwise believe. To realize, indeed, it was those amongst the ancient kingdoms of Europe who either read for themselves or had it read to them. That new world of America. To become acquainted, if you will, later when our Declaration was published, that inalienable right to pursue their happiness. In other words, as Justinian I meant, and the ancient Greeks, the first and foremost element of property is you. You. Every single individual here is entitled to yourself, the improvement, the betterment thereof, the fulfillment of your capacity, the pursuit of excellence, the pursuit of happiness. That you have that inalienable right in nature, through the laws of nature and nature's God. That is the message that I am pleased to bring you here. A message that, yes, has been adopted by me, adapted accordingly to be the better understood. But rest you assured, the message in essence of free enterprise, the message of our nation. I thank you for the opportunity you have allowed me to speak my mind freely, to reflect upon our past, because rest you assured, after 40 years in public office, and the word retirement is not in my vocabulary, I now seek what I refer to as the project of my autumn years. I call it a University of Virginia. And what subject do you think I consider the most important to be taught? History. For history, reminding us of the past, allows us better to understand where we are in the present. It will continue to bind us together upon those principles over which we shed our blood in our American Revolution. Continue to allow us to be a beacon light to the rest of the world in recognition of opportunity found through free enterprise. I would like, before I must take my leave, to welcome any curiosities or questions that you might have. You've been so gracious and well-mannered to be seated quietly and to hear what I have to say, but I would like to hear what you all have to say. Is there time, Mr. Elliott?
The President has graciously agreed to take questions. So Dr. Klugowitz is picking up a hand mic, and he will be about, and we will take questions. We have a great preference for questions over short speeches. So this is actually the question period. The short speeches will be after 9 o'clock. So Dr. Klugowitz, I believe Dr. Stacy had the first question. Dr. Stacy, could you stand? He's to your far left.
Over there, yes.
And he's not normally to the far left. That just happens to be where he is at the moment.
Mr. President, first of all, let me say I'm a graduate of the University of Virginia. I'm grateful for your role in founding that institution.
Well, I thank you for that, sir. I find it remarkable. I have not even founded it, but that just proves from what I've been told coming westward here, this is much more a land of imagination than anyone else might have realized.
I have a brief two-part question. Earlier in your political career, you had indicated a resistance to political parties, seeing them perhaps dangerous to the Republic. But then later, you found cause maybe to start a political party of your own. In many ways, the precursor to the modern Democratic Party. So my question would be, first of all, how would you respond to those who might be critical of that kind of change? And second, should maybe the current iteration of that party, in keeping with Jeffersonian principles, disband?
Well, in answer to your first question, or part of the question, sir, no. Let us not forget that we are more free than man has ever been to voice an opinion freely, to hold that opinion freely in our minds, to think freely, and to voice that opinion freely. And that is an energy that provides, if you will, the prosperity of our nation. So I welcome such criticism. And if you will, let us never forget, as you talk about faction, or the fact that I have founded a political platform, we all were a faction at one time. We grew into a faction. We were divided amongst ourselves, even within those 13 individual nations. Have we forgotten that? Each one of those former colonies were nations within themselves, differences of opinion, vast differences of opinion in religion in one versus that in another. Vast differences in the number of freeholders of one colony versus the greater number of tenants upon the freeholdings in another. But what we showed the rest of the world, and what we showed Great Britain in particular, was that we were not a radical rabble in the hinterlands or the forest primeval of North America. Rather, that we could bring 13 individual nations together, e pluribus unum, through the founding principle of compromise and resolution on behalf of the common good. But then, sir, after the victory of our American Revolution, well, we could no longer blame Great Britain, now could we? Upon certain arguments and contests that have existed in the nature of man from time immemorial. No, now then, we were contending with ourselves. Even myself, I was not satisfied with the idea of a strong constitution. I thought the Articles of Confederation were a venerable fabric. They ought not to be tampered with. But it was the most luminous, mighty mind of the little Madison that convinced me it is necessary. And I convinced him, sir, that in order for this Constitution to be held in the hands of the people, it needed a Bill of Rights, which all people upon the globe are entitled to against any government upon the globe. Do you know he answered to me in the negative? He said, we do not need a Bill of Rights. All of these rights are inferred in the Constitution. Now, where would that argument ever end? It does not. I wrote back, are we to rest upon inference on such an important subject as the inalienable rights of man? Let us not forget we were born free to declare, and we must declare that these are the inalienable rights of man. And it is that liberty and freedom to declare which quite naturally has created political platforms and factions within our nation, as it should be. And let us not desist from that conflict and contention. It must be engaged freely. Now, I will tell you, sir, that I mean no disrespect, but as a matter of correction, my platform, as it became known, was known as the Anti-Federalist Platform. We were basically in disagreement with the premises of our Secretary of the Treasury, General Alexander Hamilton. We felt the government had fallen onto its own devices, of and by itself, connected with the counting houses of this nation, might be forgetting the common man, 9 out of every 10 Americans residing on farms, with agriculture as our first interest, commerce merely as a handmaid. We later became known as the Democratic Republicans. And by the time I was invited to stand for the presidency a second time, and that was in the presidential election 1800, we became known simply as Jeffersonian Republicans. Republicans. Now, I wrote, and I will still abide by the fact I care not for any of these labels of platform. Let us be known simply as the Spirit of 76. And be mindful of those principles that united us. That as Americans, a difference of opinion must never be a difference of principle.
Barbara Elliott has a question.
It is a pleasure to have you here with us, President Jefferson. You wrote a letter to the Danbury Baptists in 1803 that contains what I would suggest is a pernicious phrase of the separation of church and state. Could you please tell us what you intended with that phrase in that letter?
Mrs. Elliott, I thank you. And with all due respect, I would consider it a pernicious phrase as well if that was precisely what I wrote. It is not. And if you will, citizens, I may remind you that when I was a young man as a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, and we were all governed by one particular monarchy, one particular parliamentary rule, and one particular church, no matter what our religious opinion was in the former colony of Virginia and the majority of our 13 colonies, save, of course, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, to an extent New York, we had to pay a tax to the support of the Church of England. By the ecclesiastical law of that church, we had to worship in the Church of England at least 12 Sundays a year, on the average one Sunday a month. And if we desisted, we were fined, and if we failed to pay our fines, we were thrown into jail. I remember before the war began, our jails in Virginia were filled with Baptists. They had come down from New England preaching a freedom for religion, and myself and Patrick Henry stood in their favor to protect and defend them in that inalienable right. And so, as our revolution commenced, and with its successful victory, I continued to pursue that inalienable right of an individual to hold their opinion upon religion freely, that it ought not to be engaged by any law that is prescribed by a civil authority. In my opinion, as I've written, and Mr. Madison wrote the same, it is a presumption for any civil authority, any government, to suggest it has the answer upon religious opinion. That's a presumption unto our Creator. And so it was, I took up the pen to draft what became the Statute of Virginia for religious freedom. Many, I want to say that, even Colonel Henry later, who was opposed to that bill for religious freedom, the Statute of Virginia of religious freedom. Citizens, no, let us not make the mistake in semantics, because it is, if you will, the crux of the disagreement over my letter to the Danbury Baptists. The semantics of the title of my bill is distinctly the bill for religious freedom, not of. Stating of religious freedom implies, if you will, a separating of religion from our lives, from the lives of those we elect to office. I have written wherever there is a freedom for religion, you see the greatest civilizing of man. When I was elected to my first term as Chief Magistrate of our nation, yes, the coterie of Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut wrote me a letter because they wanted to know from me, the author of the Bill for Religious Freedom in Virginia, whether our Constitution in its First Amendment superseded the Constitution of Connecticut, where everyone was still obligated to pay a tax to the Congregationalist Church. And I wrote back to them, prevail with patience until the Constitution of Connecticut is able to own up to the Constitution of our nation, because the Constitution of our nation is the law of the land. And then I wrote, rest you assured that no one more than myself would rather see a great wall of separation be built between church and state. I never wrote a separation of church and state. And that is where, as I've said, the twistification of the principle is wont to begin. When we provide a separation between the civil authority and the ecclesiastical authorities, we provide more liberty for each than has ever been known in the history of man, particularly more incentive for free enterprise. Is it the duty of civil authority to pronounce religious opinion, and what has that led to throughout the history of mankind? But instances of hypocrisy, meanness, and bloodshed, and is a deterrent from the plan of our holy author who has created the mind free, and free he intends it to remain, incapable of any temporal restraint. The only duty of any government and its laws is simply to protect people from injury by one and the other. Otherwise, to leave them free to pursue their own industry and their own improvement. And will not their improvement be guaranteed when a people are free to worship as they choose, and the ecclesiastical laws free to attend to their duty, which is the administration of the soul, in an effort simply to do good? So thank you for the opportunity that I might explain that correctly with respect to the semantics of the statement.
Does anyone else have a question for Mr. Jefferson? I see one over here.
Good morning, Mr. President,
My pleasure.
and thank you for your many years of service to our country. I have two short questions regarding the Louisiana Purchase. I believe there was some opposition to the purchase among members of the Congress and some of our leaders. And would you care to comment on that? I understand that one of the reasons was the cost of the Louisiana Purchase, and second, their ability to be able to defend it in case of a foreign power trying to take over part of that territory.
Yes, sir. The gentleman's two questions. How could we afford it? And secondly, how can we defend it? Well, to answer secondly first, sir, the defense rests, of course, in the fact that the westernmost regions were the easternmost ranges of what I refer to as the Stony Mountains. We had a natural defense to the west from any effort of an enemy, anyone hostile to our nation, to attack and proceed from the west. We also had a greater advantage for our defense because we then owned the Mississippi River. As I mentioned earlier, the mightiest artery of commerce upon the globe, in my opinion, cutting north-south, if you will, right through the center, known by the Aborigines collectively as the Great Multnomah. They knew the value of that mighty waterway. That as well, our great instrument of safety and defense. I've always been interested that someday we might control the Floridas and gain that method to protect and defend our nation from the southeast. So the defense of our nation was more assured, if you will, in a general agreement than the purchase price. No, it was exorbitant, particularly when I suggested initially $7 million for the purchase of New Orleans. The opposition came mostly from the Federalists connected in the cities of Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Annapolis, Norfolk, Charleston, and Savannah. Now, you may understand the reasons why. All of those cities are centers of commerce along the East Coast. They certainly did not want to see the commencing of extensive trade so far west from their markets any more than they wanted to see the settlement to the west to the 100th and 1000th generation of farmers. And yes, during the late summer of 1803, our Senate stalled on a ratifying of these Louisiana treaties. We were obligated to provide an answer to France by the middle of November, and yet the Senate would not come together in a general agreement. Can you imagine our Senate stalemating upon any subject to the benefit of the commerce of our nation? And so I will tell you that I thought it may be necessary simply to make a constitutional amendment in order to provide us this opportunity. I felt that is the only way that we are going to achieve this incredible opportunity. No, we didn't need it, because a particular individual in our nation felt that this was the most extraordinary opportunity for the further security of liberty and freedom for generations yet unborn. He was able to influence the Federalist faction in our Senate, those most closely allied with the aforementioned centers of commerce, to adopt and ratify the purchase of New Orleans and Louisiana. That was able to be achieved the middle of October. We were able to provide our answer to France by the middle of November. And do you know that it was in November, that's when France wanted the answer, that Spain finally got around to retroceding New Orleans and Louisiana to France. And then 1 month later, December, the middle of December, in New Orleans at the Cabildo that France ceded New Orleans and Louisiana to the United States. So France only occupied New Orleans and Louisiana for 1 month. Now then, sir, as a part of the purchase price, $15 million, we relaxed $2 million of debt owed to us by the French as a result of the quasi-war, that undeclared war that we engaged with them in the late 1790s. Leaving us a balance of $13 million, we received several millions of dollars from Hope & Company, the Dutch bank in Amsterdam that had helped to finance the American Revolution. But the greater balance in procuring loans, if you will, as we did from Hope & Company, for 30 years, 6% interest, the greater balance came from Baring & Company, the British bank in London, which supplied us with the greater balance of that purchase price, loans for 30 years at 6% interest. Now, can you imagine our old enemy, England, gave us the majority of the money to double, some say triple the size of our nation. We turned around and gave it to France. All I can say so simply is politics as usual. Now, I hope we do not forget the name of the gentleman who helped to ratify our Louisiana territory in New Orleans in the midst of heated controversy in our Senate. Anyone know of whom I am referring to? Well, my pleasure, citizens, lest we forget General Alexander Hamilton. General Hamilton knew that those farmers are going to need banks. And there we have it, if you will, that wonderful balance of what allows our nation to continue to move forward. It's no different than Aristotle was wont to suggest thousands of years ago that man is born with a dichotomous nature, born either to fear or born to trust, as politics will take root and emanate. It is, if you will, a sequence of the great rhythms of the universe. We are no less prone. But we created a remarkable system of government which, if it goes too far in one direction, who is called upon to come to the helm? The people. If it goes too far in another direction, who is called upon to come to the helm? The people. Never happens when we want it to, does it? But it does follow a remarkable system of things, and I have referred to it consequently as the world's best hope. Hamilton was extraordinary. Yes, we differed upon many subjects, but never let it be forgotten that we collaborated more successfully than we ever differed. Hamilton and I both believed in the defense of our coastline. I referred to it as the necessity of militia boats. He referred to it as the necessity of revenue cutters. But we agreed upon the term Coast Guard. We believed that we ought to establish a standard of currency throughout all of our states. And so thereby he allowed me to investigate and secure the decimal system of currency for our nation. I was not in favor of a standing army, particularly in times of peace. It would be a great drain upon our treasury. But I finally had to accept it. I finally had to compromise, so long as it could be led by an enlightened officer corps, and therefore General Hamilton saw fit to support, when I became president, the commission of our military academy at West Point. We both believed in a system of libraries through our nation. We both believed in a well-educated citizen body of our nation. So I thank you for that opportunity that we could reflect upon our remarkable history as Americans and how often we have come together for the benefit of generations yet unborn.
Sir, we have a question from a student here.
Mr. President, it had been my belief previously that when you had made the Louisiana Purchase, Bonaparte had wanted to give it to you to get it off his hands quickly because he needed money for his war effort in Europe. Is this the case?
That certainly was an incentive, sir. Certainly was an incentive. And the other incentive, of course, was the fact that he realized, as many did throughout the kingdoms of Europe, that the French could not possibly defend such a vast western territory. They could not defend it during the French and Indian War, and consequently they lost it. I think that Bonaparte felt, and all of us felt the same way, Mr. Livingston even wrote about it, that if we could support the French in engaging war with the British, and they then as become victorious, that perhaps Bonaparte would then turn back and make an effort to conquer the territory of Louisiana. But I think he may have realized that was an impossibility when when his navy was defeated, and of course there was the terrible experience on the island of Haiti, Saint Domingue. So history makes for curious coincidences, does it not? Oftentimes well outside of the affairs of man that enable for opportunity.
We have another question.
Good morning, Mr. President. I would be remiss, I think, if I didn't ask you this question in front of my students. You have written that all men are created equal, but yet even Mr. Franklin has created a society for the abolition of slavery. Could you define for me what you meant by men?
Well, mankind, sir, the family of man across the globe, the essence of the Justinian Code, as was mentioned earlier, everyone is born free, everyone. And so it is the element of mankind. Now, of course, if this becomes disagreeable in time, well, then I've always believed that as a child of 14 cannot wear the same clothes at the age of 40. Our laws and institutions must grow as we grow as a people, and the voice of the people to be more extensively heard, and there be an alteration to that statement in the semantics of word choice. So, no, sir, all men are created equal. Now, if you're referring to what appears to be the conflict in making a statement that way and being the owner of slaves, well, sir, the conflict would have rest if I remained silent. Again, I make statement of what I said earlier, a decided truth throughout the history of mankind. We are born free to declare, and therefore we must declare what we hold as the inalienable rights of man. The institution of slavery did not begin when I was born in 1743. It did not begin when my father was born in 1707, or when my grandfather, Thomas Jefferson the Younger, was born in the 1680s. It had been with us for several generations. Being born into this institution and recognizing its ultimate disaster, if we continued it, it was only successful for those who owned the great majority of acreage and the great majority of laborers. For the common man, it would be disastrous. They kept killing the soil one generation after the other in the cultivation of tobacco, while their labor force continued to double. And so therefore there had to be a way out. And that is why when I was elected to my first public office, my very first statement in public office was to stand in the Virginia House of Burgesses, raise my hand, call for permission, merely the permission, to begin a debate towards ending the importation of slaves. I was trounced by many of the Tidewater gentry, the elder sons who would come into the inheritance of slaves through the ancient laws of primogeniture and entail. I was one of them. I was a turncoat to my own class. And so it was, I was able to turn over the gavel to Mr. Madison 40 years later, and to realize the year previous we followed an obligation in our Constitution to provide a vote on to whether we continue the importation of slaves. We finally ended that, sir, in 1808. It took me 40 years to see that to be realized. And I cannot deny that it was the influence of our former enemy, England, particularly through the efforts of William Wilberforce to have ended that a year before we ended the importation. You are correct about Dr. Franklin, sir, but even before him, I was invited to attend to a ceremony in Philadelphia City commemorating the time when William Penn stepped foot the first time on the soil of what became Pennsylvania, although it was not Pennsylvania at the time. He considered it so. It was contested by the Calvert family of Maryland. And so when William Penn arrived in the New World, he stepped foot for the first time, anyone know? In Newcastle, in the county of Delaware, to stake claim there. Well, as you know, the argument did not desist, and finally they brought over Messrs. Mason and Dixon to end that argument, draw a line, use the point of the compass to draw an arc around from Newcastle to allow them to Delaware County to become a colony unto itself. But my point being that invited to the commemoration, I wrote back to Monsieur Peter Stephen Duponchot that I would be unable to attend. Ill health prevents me. However, were I to be there, and please say in my stead, I consider William Penn perhaps the greatest lawgiver the world ever produced. William Penn. For he, more than any other, upon a tabula rasa, established the first system of public schools, the first laws to guarantee and secure freedom for religion, and established the first slave emancipation society in the Western world. And William Penn was a slave owner. There needs to be that point from which one begins. Is that not the essence, as Euclid explained, of geometry? The philosophy of space, of vastness. It must all begin with a point.